Hello and welcome to the Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Over the next 60 minutes, we'll bring you some of the very best interviews and reports from the past week here on Monocle Radio. This week, we'll look at the latest developments in Lebanon.
It was a heavy night of bombardments, probably one of the most intense we've seen in terms of Israeli strikes in Lebanon since the start of the war.
Plus, we speak with the publisher of the Wall Street Journal.
People put a premium on the reliability of information. That also means, as a business, we can treat this as a premium product.
All that and much more in the next hour, here on The Curator, with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. We start The Curator in Lebanon, with a story from Friday's Globalist. We spoke with Hannah McCarthy, foreign correspondent in Beirut, and Sir Mark Lyle Grant, the UK's ambassador to the United Nations between 2009 and 2015. They spoke to us on the week that device explosions killed at least 37 people and wounded close to 3,000 in the country.
It was a heavy night of bombardments, probably one of the most intense we've seen in terms of Israeli strikes in Lebanon since the start of the war. The strikes, though, were still focused around southern Lebanon, some in the Bekaa. They didn't hit Beirut, they didn't hit major population centres or the centre of Israel. So while they were definitely intense, they didn't necessarily target substantially new area. It's not quite clear, were they timed to go right after Nasrallah's speech, or were they in response to Hezbollah's strikes earlier that day on northern Israel, which resulted in 2 soldiers being killed. Both of those types of events could have precipitated a kind of more intense bombardment from Israel. Israel say they were targeting Hezbollah rocket launchers in these strikes, but it has definitely created a sense of things moving towards, or certainly escalating.
What did Nasrallah say in his speech?
Sure. So I watched the beginning of the speech in Dahiyeh in southern Beirut, which is kind of Hezbollah stronghold. So people were, in cafes watching this speech on big screens. They were kind of keen to see what he said, because this week he recognised that they had been a hard and severe blow for Hezbollah, and he said there was being an investigation to how exactly this happened. We also heard him describe the attacks as a declaration of war, that they require a response. He won't say when, where and how, but there will be one. And I think what was interesting is that he reinforced Hezbollah's alliance with Hamas in Gaza. I think after the attacks this week, there could be lower rank Hezbollah members who are questioning whether Hezbollah should be suffering this much for Hamas or for Gaza. And certainly what we heard from Nasrallah is that there will be no cessation in the hostilities that Hezbollah is engaging with in Israel until there's a ceasefire in Gaza. And that ceasefire in Gaza seems further away than ever. We have reports now that the Biden administration has said they don't expect a ceasefire deal or a hostage deal to be agreed during the time of their administration, at least before the elections. And again, that could be until January. So again, quite a pessimistic outlook for a ceasefire.
I'd like to bring in Sir Mark Lyle Grant now, the UK's ambassador to the United Nations between 2009 and 2015. Many thanks for joining us. What about the reaction in the rest of the world to what's going on, particularly in Lebanon at the moment, Mark?
Well, I think people are fairly sort of horrified by the risk of escalation that this latest incident indicates. The Americans have been working for months now on some form of ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, and they have said publicly that this sort of activity on the Lebanese-Israeli border is deeply unhelpful for the prospects of that ceasefire. Personally, I don't think the prospects were very high anyway, but this makes it virtually impossible for the Americans to push forward for that ceasefire, and then left rather helplessly calling for restraint on both sides now, because it looks as though the Israelis might be preparing a more full-scale attack on Hezbollah south of the Litani River.
Now, we know that there'll be an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council today. What do we know about this meeting, and how do emergency meetings like this usually run? Can they have a big effect on what happens?
Well, they can do, but this one won't, I don't think, because the Security Council is so divided on this issue. It's been called by Algeria, who is the Arab member of the UN Security Council this year, and any member can call an emergency meeting at essentially 3 hours' notice. This meeting is going to take place later today in New York, and there will be a lot of angry rhetoric, I'm sure, from a lot of members. But I doubt that it will end up in any form of agreed resolution, because I think the Americans will once again protect Israel when it comes to voting in the Security Council.
So on Wednesday, the UN voted against Israel's occupation of Palestine and ordered Israel to vacate occupied Palestinian territory within a year. Can you tell us more about this vote? I mean, I gather it's non-binding, but it is the first time in history of the UN that Palestine's been able to introduce its own draft resolution.
Well, it's interesting for that reason, but as you say, it's non-binding. And the reason it's non-binding is it wasn't a Security Council resolution, it was a UN General Assembly resolution. 124 of the 193 countries, so roughly 2/3, voted in favour, demanding that Israel ends its unlawful occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. But it won't have any effect. It's certainly not the first resolution of this type. Indeed, there have been Security Council resolutions which have declared these illegal settlements in the West Bank at least should cease. And that hasn't had any impact on Israel either. So I don't think either the General Assembly resolution of a couple of days ago or tonight's Security Council meeting will unfortunately make any difference on the ground.
What about the annual high-level UN General Assembly, which takes place next week? I mean, we've got something like 130 world leaders attending that. What are your expectations? Could that move the dial?
I think it's always an important meeting, but not least because of the sort of bilaterals that take place in the margins of the set piece meetings. I don't think it will necessarily move the dial on the Middle East, although there'll be a lot of discussion of that. But there'll also be a lot of discussion on Russia-Ukraine. And for me, I think it's more likely that there might be some shift in the dial on that than there will be on the Middle East, because President Zelensky of Ukraine is going, and he's going to present some sort of peace proposals. So it'll be very interesting to see how that happens next week.
And now we're looking at the foreign desk here for a wider look at what Ukraine is doing in Kursk. Andrew Mueller and the foreign desk team sat down with Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, a retired American officer who served as Commanding General, U.S. Army Europe, and is now chair of the Future and Security Defense Council. General Hodges brought along a big map of Ukraine's border with Russia, with which they could better understand the Kursk invasion. Andrew began by asking General Hodges if he could give an idea as to how difficult it is to put together an operation like that.
Even in ideal circumstances, it's difficult because you're trying to protect information, you're trying to mass the necessary forces and logistics without being detected by the enemy, and you never ever have enough to do everything that needs to be done. So you're having to accept risk in other places to accumulate enough capability to accomplish the task. And so that's what the Ukrainians have done here. They surprised the Russians, they surprised us with this Kursk counteroffensive.
Do you think they've surprised themselves at how far they've been allowed to progress and how long they've been allowed to stay on Russian territory?
No. We continue to underestimate them. We always underestimate them. They know this area. I mean, this is on their border. They know who the Russians are. They know who the commanders are. They know all the rivalries and how the FSB and the general staff hate each other on the Russian side. They know all that. So I think that they probably are amused how we continue to be surprised at how effective they are. It's not perfect. And also keep in mind, this is not happening in a vacuum. They are still striking oil and gas infrastructure and airfields deep inside of Russia. They just sank the remaining ferry that connected Crimea to the Russian mainland. So all of these things are also going on. And the Russians are relentlessly attacking Ukrainian cities. So they're having to protect their rear area at the same time. The Ukrainians are doing what we talk about doing, which is multi-domain operations. They're actually doing it.
Is there still a dynamic, though, of it almost looks at some levels, and again, referring to your map, because Russia is still reported to be on the advance in parts of occupied Ukraine. There was this idea, it may have been a simplistic interpretation of events, that Ukraine was hoping that if we create this incursion into Kursk, Russia will be obliged to respond by withdrawing troops that are occupying Ukraine. Is Russia just not taking the bait, or is Russia just not able to move that quickly even if it wanted to?
I think it's some of both. First of all, for context, this war has been going on 10 and a half years. The Russians control less than 20% of Ukraine after 10 and a half years with every advantage. And so when we talk about their occupying part of Ukraine, yes, that far eastern sliver of Ukraine is where they are. Now, I remember being at the Munich Security Conference back in February when the city of Avdiivka was finally taken by the Russians. And people were walking around like, oh my God, Avdiivka has fallen, even though they had no damn idea where Avdiivka actually was. But they were like, oh my God, Avdiivka has fallen, as if it was Stalingrad. And now Pokrovsk is the town that everybody talks about, the strategically vital town of Pokrovsk. It's a whopping 60 kilometers from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk. The Russians are not there yet. So in other words, in 6 months, they have advanced about 55 kilometers. And this was during the period when the United States quit providing ammunition. So I think the Ukrainians correctly assessed that Russia does not have the capability to just overwhelm and exploit any tactical success they might have out in the east. So the threat out there is enough that the Ukrainian general staff could tell the commander here, hey man, I'm sorry, I don't have anything else to give you, but I need you to keep doing what you're doing because we need to mass up here for the main effort. And this is classic military doctrine. This is called economy of force. This is the main effort. Every commander since Caesar has had to take risk in one place in order to achieve the mass needed at the more important place.
If it does turn out that the Ukrainians in Kursk find themselves with more time and space than they thought they were going to have or that they really needed, is there a way that you can see that they can make further advantage of it?
So because the Ukrainians have been so good at protecting information, we don't know exactly what their desired outcome is. I mean, President Zelensky talked about creating a buffer, and in fact, they have pushed back Russian forces here so that the Russians are no longer able to park here and just launch attacks against Ukrainian cities like Sumy, for example. But we don't know how long they intend to stay, what other effects they want to achieve. I'm sure you're right, as you said earlier, that they were hoping to draw off some of the Russian forces here. So how long they stay will depend on whether or not they're achieving the effect. If the Russians are not able to respond with enough combat power to eliminate this bridgehead, then I think they'll probably continue to stay there. They'll continue to strengthen the perimeter of this bridgehead, dig in. Eventually, the Russians will start to mass capabilities against it, but they have been slow and ineffective thus far. And I've tried to figure out why is that. So I did a little very simplistic approach to try and measure the distance from, say, around Pokrovsk to get up here to Zhuhai. That's the place where the big gas hub is located. So just straight line distance, of course, it's about 600 kilometers. Well, obviously, the Russians are not going to be able to take that route because it goes right through Kharkiv and Ukraine territory. So they're going to have to go around to get here, assuming even if they had anticipated the requirement to do it, it would take weeks to get enough trucks and or rail cars, bring them together, to put enough troops on board to shift them around to try and respond. So chances are they were not anticipating this, so they had to begin from a cold start to get the rail, the trucks marshaled to start moving. And that's assuming somebody made the decision that they wanted to do that. And I think this goes to the point of your question. I'm not entirely convinced that they, in the Kremlin, that they've made that decision. This rivalry between the FSB, which is responsible for this, and the General Staff, which is responsible for this.
That's the FSB in Kursk and the General Staff in
That's correct.
Donbass.
In the beginning, the Kremlin put the FSB in charge of dealing with this Kursk counteroffensive because they wanted to characterize it as a terrorist operation, so we're going to put FSB on it. And FSB, by the way, owns the border force. So you've got a command structure that's not very joined up, and it's not conducive to good cooperation and intelligence sharing. And so I don't think the General Staff is in a hurry to send troops away from their focus to help deal with that. And then even if it was ideal, the logistics required, it's a challenge. Now, of course, the Ukrainians will have anticipated each of these possibilities. This rail network is already being attacked by different means by the Ukrainian side. I will be surprised if the Russians are able to do enough in the next couple of weeks to significantly reduce the bridgehead that the Ukrainians have achieved.
We are back with the Curator on Monocle Radio with me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. An interview I really enjoyed doing this week was with Amar Latour. He stopped by a Midori House. He's the CEO of Dow Jones and also publisher of the Wall Street Journal.
I am a journalist at heart, and you never quite lose that instinct and that impulse. But I started as a news assistant for the Wall Street Journal, prior to that an intern. That was very early in my career. I was based in many different countries as a foreign correspondent, and it was in Brussels, in Stockholm, right here in London, a reporter as well in New York. I was a real scoop hound. I like breaking stories, so I still feel that drive to get the story these days.
I always feel it's a good sign when you start as an intern, and now look at you, so...
You started as an intern.
Exactly.
Yeah, there you go.
Maybe that's why I was saying this as well. First of all, one question. We're definitely going to be talking about the Wall Street Journal here, but tell us about Dow Jones. What does the group encompasses? Because there are quite a few brands in this group, right?
It's a group of publications and verticals, if you will, a company that's focused on reliable information for business people to make decisions, for people in policy to make decisions, for people in their lives to make business decisions of sorts. There are different areas of focus. There's business news. That's the Wall Street Journal, prime example of that. There is wealth and investing news and information. That's Barron's and Market Watch. These are sizable publications in their own right with a devoted fan base. Then we have areas where there's news, but there's also data and analytics. Energy is one area that is incredibly important to the world and to us as a business as well, where we offer data on different commodities, where we offer analytics and forecasting. There's a business that focuses on risk. For example, as a company, how do you respond to sanctions, and how do you avoid doing business with people or entities that are on a sanctions list? There's a search engine, a business search engine called Factiva that has billions of articles that knowledge workers use. But Dow Jones is about reliable information for people to make decisions in their business life and in their personal lives.
You mentioned reliable there. I mean, let's be honest, Omar, we're living in a kind of unpredictable world in the last years. Do you think people go to the source? Because I've been looking at the numbers of digital subscriptions and there's been growth among Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal. Do you think that's one of the reasons people are looking for this reliability in a way?
Well, there's so much noise and there's so much misinformation. There's so much opinion, often undeclared opinion, and so there's so much confusion. I think there's a great deal of anxiety around that among readers and consumers of news and information around the world. And so, yes, when people finally find a place where they feel, I can trust this information, I think that's comforting. I think it helps them in their daily lives. And yes, that translates into good business. Definitely for us, we have seen across Dow Jones a sharp increase in our business. For the Wall Street Journal itself, we have more subscriptions than ever before. We see that for Barron's, for Market Watch as well. And so there is a premium for in your life. People put a premium on the reliability of information. That also means, as a business, we can treat this as a premium product.
And I was reading one of your interviews, I mean, when you were talking about this growth as well, that you almost wanted to double down on what you guys do best, business. And of course, to be honest, I'm a fan of the brand. I love the magazine. I love the quirky articles. But is that your approach that, listen, guys, we do this well. We do business very well. So let's definitely focus our resources on that. Is that the approach you take?
Yes, you have to, in modern day publishing, you have to be aware of what your strength is, of what your focus is. And I believe in order to be successful, you do have to double down on that. Now, the way we define business, one, it's of course narrating what's happening in the actual business world, but it's also the business lens on the wider world. And the articles that you're referencing, that type of coverage, we still retain that business lens, which is a little bit detached, but finding the unique angle, very often data-driven stories that come out no matter where we focus that lens. And so that's our strength. That's where we've decided, and definitely I've pushed us to make sure that we do stay focused and that we don't dilute our presence and dilute our focus at the expense of what we're really good at and what we're known for.
And more big names this week on Monocle Radio. Our very own Tom Webb spoke to Serbian performance artist Marina Abramovic for the latest episode of Monocle on Culture.
This all work actually started being developed after I walked the Great Wall of China, when I saw the different territories I walk, and each time I felt consciously a different energy. When I walk with the quartz, I felt different. With the clay ground, I feel different. With the copper or the iron, I feel different. And I understand that actually there is energy in the stones. And as I was walking the Great Wall of China for 3 months without being exposed to any public, completely by myself, with the Red Army soldiers, I was thinking how I can transform that actually emotions and also that my discovery to the public. So when I came back from the walk, I started creating something called transitory objects. And they're not sculptures. I don't want to make sculptures. I don't want to make anything permanent because I'm a performance artist. For me, it's very important that it's actually transitory, so that you use these objects in order to trigger experience. So they're like tools. And then once you have experience, objects can be also removed. And the entire space here with healing frequency is actually based on 3 basic human positions: standing, sitting, and lying. And the public can have the plugs to completely isolate from the sounds around and the public and emerge in this experience.
So you're actually holding physical earplugs here. How would you love people to interact with your space here?
I would like so much that they really take these physical plugs, put in the ears, so that they are not conscious so much of the public and noise. I really want them to use these objects, sitting, standing, lying. I want them to close their eyes and they don't hear any interruption around, so that they can emerge into that actually experience. My work is highly emotional, but at the same time, it's a public space, so you have to have this concentration that you kind of isolate yourself in that experience here.
So why do you need to go to such extremes, such as earplugs, to elicit that concentration? Do you believe that technology is becoming a barrier towards interactions with art?
But look how fucked up we are. I mean, this is insane. I mean, we are technology. Nothing's wrong with technology. Our addiction to technology, which is wrong, because we are completely addicted. We can't live without telephone. We can't live without computer. We look at the watch every 5 minutes, what time it is. So we completely lost our spiritual center because of that. We actually afraid to be about ourselves. We constantly have to be entertained. Constantly have to see something or do something or control something with our devices, and every time it's new gadget we have to have it. So this is how the entire community is going into wrong direction. So an artist, you should really see that and give some solutions. For me, my advice is, let's go back to simplicity. Let's go back to nature. Let's see what the minerals are. Let's see how the physically we can feel that kind of energy. And then just, I'm helping you by actually giving you these objects, transitory objects, to interact.
And can you talk us through some of these physical objects that people can interact with here?
okay, this is like right away you're sitting here and we are looking into the chair for human and the chair for spirit. So as you see, the human chair is quite big, and then you have to put your legs a little bit off the ground, which is very important, so you're not touching the ground, you see, because then you feel different gravitation. You're not pulled down, you're a little bit lift up. Then you have the crystal. One is the black quartz, one is white quartz, very different energy that you can experience. And then next to this, each chair is a tiny little chair, and this is also made with the legs who are, clear quartz touching the ground. And that chair is not to sit. That chair is a spirit, your own spirit. But if you don't see your own spirit, it's not my problem. I mean, this is the whole thing about, feeling where is your spirit, where is your other self. So this is very interesting conversational, object here between you, your spirit, but also with the person sitting opposite of you.
And what do you think the role of performance art is in contemporary society?
Performance is like phoenix. Disappear and reappear, disappear and reappear, but never actually go away. It's very interesting when society is in a progress and economically they're doing very well, then the art become commodity and become very expensive. And only the few people can really afford, and performers completely disappear. But the moment when the economy is going bad and the art is unaffordable, performance comes up and become very important, because performance is something, it's time-based art, you have to be there to experience, but it's also something that is so direct, it's like a direct relation to the viewer. And in this century, 21st, which we live in, I think the public is so fed up going to the museum to look something. Public need to be part of something. Performers give them this opportunity to be part of something.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
We're back with the Curator, and the entrepreneurs this week was very fun. Tom Edwards spoke with wine expert Monocle friend and editor of Wine Cellar Journal Chandra Kurt. She shared some tips for discovering new wine markets.
It is not yet, let's say, very alarming, but wine consumption goes down because our eating habits changed a little bit. You have a new generation coming that thinks different about body or health, so they didn't realize that alcohol can be something good, or not yet, because, since there's humankind, there is wine drinking, or at least beer drinking. So it's not only bad, but you also have, with warmer climate, you want to drink different. And then, of course, you have this growth of non-alcoholic wines, or they're not wines, they shouldn't be called wines, but non-alcoholic drinks. So it's a kind of a total time of fragmentation. And I think for a lot of wineries, it's not going to be easy to keep up with all of this new orientation and changes.
Yeah, lots of pressures. But listen, Monocle so well. And obviously, we always look for optimism, don't we? Avenues of opportunity. Tell me a little bit about where we should look, Chandra, where there's really good news stories, maybe that are bucking those trends and demonstrating maybe the way to, bring the new generation on board and to make sure that people really appreciate that an enjoyment of wine. It's not just about health and well-being. There's so much more to it. Where should we be looking to find that kind of inspiration?
Well, the beautiful thing is you find it all over. And what is nice, you can start by looking at small wine producers, like more farming wine places, where food and wine and land and animals on the land are connected. Because what you find more and more is like farms which really don't do only wine, but also other kind of nutrition. They plant wines that come from the country, are local, regional. So what I want to say is go start regional, because the regional creation is booming. And I think it's also good for us not to travel too far sometimes, and really to support also the regional production.
Well, that leads me very elegantly onto, of course, what Monocle does. We very much fly the flag for wine drinking. But specifically, we actually have a new wine, don't we? Our listeners, if they're in Zurich, they can head to Duvelstrasse and enjoy for themselves. I know you've sampled it, Chandra. Tell us a little bit, and tell our listeners a little bit about what that is and how it represents some of Monocle's values as well.
Yeah, so the beautiful thing is there's really the Monocle family that I love very much. They also love to drink wine. And we are here in Switzerland, or the headquarters is now in Switzerland. Some other countries will not know, but in Switzerland we have a wonderful wine production that we hardly export because we drink it all in the country. We are like unique in this. And so together with Tyler, I think it's the third wine we created. Now came out our Non Filtré. It's a special wine from Neuchâtel, from down with our major grape Chasselas, which is a neutral taste in white wine, like it fits to our neutral country. And non filtré, why? Because it's unfiltered and it has a little bit still yeast in it. So usually before you drink this like refreshing dry white, you shake the bottle, shake it up and down, and then it gets more cloudy. And it's a wonderful aperitif wine that you can also enjoy to light dishes or fish or cheese. Like in Switzerland, this is very common to do.
I love the sound of that. And just on that point, Chandra, I'm still, it's been sort of a little bit sunnier actually this week in London. So I'm kind of doubling down that it's still summer. A playful Provençal rosé, that's fine. I will still drink a Vino Verde. I'm not letting summer go. But as the kind of autumn draws in a little bit, what do we do? Do we just pivot directly to red? Or what other things should I be thinking about if I want to kind of keep a little bit of summer playfulness, but, reflect that the evenings are mellowing a little?
Yeah, the funny thing is about, you mentioned red wine, red wine consumption like globally goes slightly down. And this is also connected to the climate that change a little bit and our eating habits. But you find new red wines on the market now that are like lighter red wines that you even drink chilled, for example. So you could start with something like this coming from the Etna, like a Nerello Mascalese, or, some Beaujolais that is not too heavy. So lighter red wines would be surely a good way to go. What is very much booming, of course, white wine is always in, but are the sparkling wines. And they don't have necessarily to be coming from the Champagne. They come from all over and can be in style like the natural direction, which are the pet nut wines. They are very lightly gentle. Or you go like to Italy, the Franciacorta, Trento Doc. I'm just back yesterday. I was in Penedès to taste some cavas and what is going on there. And they really pricely are very attractive. So the whole cava production. So I think sparkling wine, anyway, you always feel good when enjoying some bubbles. So why not to stock up your frigo with some sparkle?
We're back with the Curator, and now it's time for Food Neighborhoods. With the leaves beginning to turn golden brown in the Northern Hemisphere, Monocle's Sana Giummani takes us on a tour of Boston and Cambridge in Massachusetts, an area renowned for its autumnal fare as well as its varied culinary scene.
Boston is famous for many things. Picturesque scenes on autumn days, its prestigious universities, the Red Sox and the Celtics, its significance in American history.
Take me to the Boston Globe on Morrissey Boulevard.
And its role as a backdrop for some of cinema's greatest.
You don't have the faintest idea what you're talking about. You've never been out of Boston.
With all of the best parts of a major metropolis, but none of the congestion of New York or the traffic of LA, Boston is an underrated gem of the United States. And what many people may not know is that Boston boasts a vibrant and diverse food scene that can satisfy any craving. How does one start a perfect day in Boston? Turns out by starting not in Boston. Just across the Charles River lies Cambridge, filled with everything from quaint cafes and cheap eats to upscale dining experiences. Cambridge is a must-go for anyone visiting the Boston area. Start your day off by getting in the out-the-door line at Brookline Lunch in Central Square. The popular cafe serves up delicious breakfast fare, and the queue is worth it for a Greek omelette, some buttermilk pancakes, or huevos rancheros. Whilst you're there, be sure to stop by Vietnamese cafe Cicada for a baked salmon banh mi with avocado pate and pickled veggies, and my personal favourite, their hibiscus cold brew tea. For a dose of culture, venture up to the Harvard Art Museum for a look at European and American art from the Middle Ages to the present day. Now, it's time to head back to the city. Characterized by cozy brownstones and cobbled streets, Beacon Hill is the part of Boston that one might see in a magazine or a film. My personal favorite way to spend a lazy Sunday is by strolling along Charles Street, and browsing the bookshelves of Beacon Hill Books and Cafe. Opened just last year, this new space is a quiet and comforting haven where one can take shelter from Boston's brisk weather. Head downstairs for a hot cinnamon cider or a lemon za'atar quiche, then peruse their shelves for your next read. The rest of the afternoon should be spent enjoying the vast green spaces of the nearby Boston Public Garden and the adjacent Boston Common, the oldest city park in the United States. If you're there in autumn, stop to take in the changing colors of the foliage. If you're looking for somewhere to spend a lively evening, head over to Beehive in Southend for great food and live music. Enjoy their grilled salmon with heirloom tomatoes, black rice, and radish tzatziki, or their ricotta gnocchi with brown butter, pesto, and shiitake. Have a drink or two if you fancy it. I recommend the Queen Bee, a refreshing grapefruit drink with elderflower, sparkling wine, and a splash of vodka. Enjoy the vibrant jazz performances that regularly take place at this city favorite. One can't talk about the food scene in Boston without mentioning cheap eats. As the college town of America, students in Boston are always on the lookout for affordable dining options that are big on flavor. In Back Bay, nestled on Massachusetts Avenue near the Berklee College of Music, is Pho Basil, a no-frills eatery with a mix of Thai and Vietnamese fare. On a crisp autumn evening, nothing beats a steaming bowl of pho or drunken noodles with crispy chicken, stir-fried with egg and mixed vegetables in a spicy sauce. While you're in Back Bay, head over to Newbury Street for dessert. Founded in 1975, Emack and Bolio's, a Boston-founded ice cream shop turned international sweet treat sensation, is the place to go. In addition to their vast array of ice cream flavors, choose from sorbets, frozen yogurt, milkshakes, and vegan options. I always opt for S'moreo, but one can't go wrong with mud pie, coffee with chocolate chips and Oreos, or Beantown Buzz, espresso cookie crunch with decadent chocolate-covered espresso beans. If you're after a different kind of sweet treat, head to the North End. The North End, Boston's Little Italy, is the city's oldest residential community. Here you'll find street blocks packed with family-owned Italian restaurants and cafes that have been around for generations. There's one thing in particular, though, that the area is famous for: cannolis. Bostonians have strong opinions when it comes to cannolis. Located just a few doors down from each other in this historic Italian-American neighborhood, the long-standing debate continues between which North End institution does the dessert better: Mike's Pastry or Modern Pastry. The only way to settle the debate is to try both. Grab a pistachio cannoli with ricotta filling from each shop and decide which one is the king. A perfectly sweet way to end your Boston trip.
And are you a fan of Uzbek disco? This week I had the pleasure also to speak with the founder of Ostinato Records, Vic Sohoni. He just released a new compilation entitled Synthesizing the Silk Roads, Uzbek disco, Tajik folktronica, Uyghur rock and Crimean Tatar jazz from 1980s Soviet Central Asia. Let's have a listen.
Лагуна, коралловый риф, далекие звуки маримбы и регги-мотив.
People don't really know how much of world history has emanated from this part of the world. And so Central Asia, Uzbekistan in particular, was a very important part of the world to shift our gears, to continue our philosophy of exposing people to different cultures and kind of bringing the world culturally into a post-Western era. But Tashkent in particular, this city is phenomenal. I mean, this is one of the most beautiful cities I've ever been to. It was, it's a series of lavish gardens, wide boulevards, so many conservatories, universities of music. I mean, people have this impression the Soviet Union was repressive, and yes, it was, but there was a huge emphasis on culture in the Soviet Union. And the legacy of that you can see very clearly when you walk around Tashkent, because the amount of music academies and conservatories and schools, it's just, the city is peppered with it. So, as soon as we arrived, we knew we were somewhere special. And there's this wonderful blend of architecture between the Soviet brutalist architecture and the ancient Central Asian indigenous architecture, those beautiful palettes and colors that you see and patterns that you see on the windows. So I was like, I'm in a fascinating part of the world here. And when you walk into a restaurant or a bar in Tashkent, it is so diverse. You have people who are ethnically from East Asia. You have people who are ethnically Persian, Indian, Arab, Russian, European. I mean, it's just, what a wonderfully diverse place. And the amount of people that have crossed through this region for centuries, whether if you're trading between East Asia and the Mediterranean, those ancient Silk Roads, the amount of traders and people that came and went and left things. So the music is a wonderful, wonderful blend of Europe and Asia, of Turkey, of Iran, of India, of China, of Russia, of so many parts of the world. And they all meet here. And I hope this album, the idea was to introduce people to the music, which is phenomenal, but also to say, you might want to check this part of the world out because it's coming back in a big, big way.
Regi, regi, tancujuši ostrov. Regi, regi, oh. Regi, regi, ta prosta opasna nebo.
I want to check it out. And let's talk about music. What type of music genres do you focus on this particular compilation as well? Because even the name, I think, says it all, from Uzbek disco to Tajik folktronica. I mean, that already caught my eye.
Yeah, so, when we were sifting through all the music, I realized there's so much here. There is, one thing I should mention about Tashkent, it was also kind of a central hub for all the musicians in the Asian portion of the Soviet Union. So Tashkent was where you went to find a sanctuary, a safe haven, because for centuries, it has been a very welcoming hub for everyone. And even if you visit today, you'll see that. I mean, what a warm welcome you'll get, no matter where you're from in the world. And so musicians found a very welcoming and fruitful sanctuary there. So you had musicians from neighboring countries like Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, even from China. We talk about the Uyghurs from the Western China, we see it brought up in the news a lot these days. Uyghur musicians found a sanctuary in Tashkent. You talk about Tatar musicians from Crimea. People don't know about the indigenous Tatars of Crimea. They've been fighting for their independence, but under the Soviet Union, they faced a lot of repression. So they went to Tashkent to make their music. So Tashkent was this brimming place with all of these musicians from the Asian portion of the Soviet Union. It's very important that I emphasize that because there was a European side of the Soviet Union, which is currently Eastern Europe, the Baltics, Ukraine, which had its own scene going on. But if you were of the Asian portion of the Soviet Union, this was this vast Eurasian country, you went to Tashkent to make music. It had the studios, it had the manufacturing facilities. So you can imagine the amount of genres. It's almost genre defying. I mean, you have disco, what we would classify as disco. You have, traditional folk music played on a synthesizer and made with drum machines to make it a little more electronic for the 1980s. So you have that kind of genre. You have rock and jazz and funk music. The Uyghur track to me was, still today when I listen to that, it's one of the most addictive tunes. You listen to the very last track on the album by Ismail Jalilov, a beautiful acoustic that breaks out into this jazz. You listen to one of my favorite tracks on the album, Bunami Bu, which means What's This, which is like a heavy Soviet dance track.
I love this tune by Original, the band, right?
Yes.
Wow.
It is such a heavy dance track. I mean, so, we can sit here and say this is disco, this is jazz, this is funk. You ask the musicians, they're like, I don't know. I mean, this is just the music we were making. It doesn't even have a name. We unfortunately have to give names to things that are nameless, that are ethereal, that are just, we can't even classify it. So
I wrote it down in my notes, space disco. That's how I felt, but could be.
It's definitely, I mean, and you think about how they were making music, where they were making music, the philosophy, the driving force behind their music. And you realize that this was something very special happening at a very special time by the youth of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Just prior to its fall, there was something happening amongst the youth that made them produce this very, I wouldn't even say it was the whole 80s. It was a very specific, the late 80s era where there was a call actually, because so many disco clubs existed in the Soviet Union. They were sprouting up all over the Soviet Union, and the propaganda and ideology departments had a little bit of a fray with them to say, okay, you can do this, but you have to be like this, and we want to control a little bit, but we can't control everything. But these disco clubs took a life of their own. They became places where youth went, They drank, they danced, they had parties. It was phenomenal to even read about or to interview musicians about.
And from Monocle Design, the Monocle team shared some highlights from London Fashion Week, including the brands Aluvalia, SS Daily and Derek.
I can start with my first show that I saw on Friday, which was SS Daily by the designer Stephen Stocky Daly. He's a menswear designer, but he presented his first women's wear collection at the Royal Academy of Arts. And I thought it was such an incredible debut. He sort of translated what he does really well in menswear to women's beautifully. I love what he does in the sense that there's a lot of British references, tailoring, but also a lot of British humor. So you saw very strict, perfectly executed suiting, but also a dress with a Dalmatian on it, and really fun sort of jacquard neat sweaters. And I thought it's a stellar debut. And he's also really smart. He got one of his famous clients, Harry Styles, to invest.
Ask you, did you see him?
I did see him come in. He wore a nice navy suit by SS Daily Men's. There is a big conversation happening that British brands are independent and struggling to stay afloat, and rather than going the traditional route, getting someone who loves your brand, who understands it and wears it, to invest in it and also give you publicity is a really smart route, and I think he'll keep expanding and we'll be seeing more of him.
Is there something to be said as well? I'm assuming you're seeing, all sorts of influencers out at these shows. To have somebody that's a bona fide star at something like this, how significant is that?
In London, it's not as common. Just because these brands are smaller, they don't have budgets to pay the celebrities to come more. But what's interesting is that when you do see these people, it shows you that they genuinely want to be there. They're not paid to be there. So it's a lot more genuine, and they wear the clothes their own way. It's a nicer way, I think, for brands to interact with celebrities. So Harry Styles was there because he's invested in the brand. He likes it. I always see interesting people at the J.W. Anderson shows, which was another of my highlights. It's interesting to see which of these personalities go to the shows out of their own goodwill.
If we're talking about their role in the fashion industry, do we then need to see them wearing these clothes in a year's time or whenever they're off the runways? Is that also part of this ecosystem?
Yes, I think it influences us whether we like it or not when you see public figures wearing the clothes, some more than others. I'd like to think that I have my own taste and I don't look at celebrities, but that's illusion, isn't it?
Lots of this looks like it can go straight from the runway into our wardrobes. Is London a little bit more direct in terms of like its ability to be immediately translated into everyday life, or is there an element of play and adventure too?
I'd say not at all, actually. A lot of the shows you see, they're so creative and over the top, and that's why I love London Fashion Week, but it is quite rare to see a show and be like, oh, obviously straight to the racks. I saw like Bora Aksu and Yuhan Wang, and I've always loved what they do, but it's not at all my style, and it's always very like world building, lots of layers, lots of colours, lots of layers. But one of my highlights actually was Derek, which is a new brand that was started by this Central St Martin's grad called Luke Derek, and he is very influenced by East London. His debut last year was called Night Walking, and it was so cool. And this was his summer collection, but it was called Rain Check, which was so funny because we've had the most awful summer in London, and I actually think a lot of the shows I saw reflected this because they all had like trench coats and jumpers at some stage. Derek's show was like a lot of like functional nylon, lots of waterproof fabrics, cotton t-shirts but with a scarf in case it gets cold. He trained on Savile Row and with like Brioni and Dunhill, so he's got that tailoring background, but it is just very like modern and cool and fresh. And you'll know this because I know you're on TikTok, Nick, but being British is quite cool at the moment. There's this trend called Brit Maxing, and I think it's with the Oasis reunion. Suddenly being in London is a little bit cooler, and I thought I could sense this in the mood of Fashion Week and like people being excited for Charlie XCX performing. But Natalie, you said you weren't so sure.
Yeah, I can see what you mean, and it's interesting that this idea of Britishness is becoming a lot cooler again, and even other brands like Celine, which is a French house, referencing it really heavily in their latest menswear collection. So there is a moment definitely happening. I do agree with you. And there was kind of a celebratory atmosphere, given that it is 40 years of Fashion Week. What I thought, and the conversations that I was having that weren't as jolly, let's say, was that the schedule is much thinner than it used to be. A lot of the designers cannot afford to host shows like they used to. A lot of them had to just stop operating completely, including my absolute favorite and Nick's wife's favorite, Christopher Kane, and shout out to Hannah.
She'll definitely be listening to this. I'm curious then, so what's the solution? I cover more furniture, architecture. Every now and again you let me do a little bit on fashion, but it seems to be more about the manufacturing, less about the style. I won't take that personally. Solutions people have found in Milan at Milan Design Week is doing little pop-up shows in the street or taking over a car bay and presenting their work there. Are there workarounds? Are there ways for brands to still get their work out there during Fashion Week without breaking the bank?
Fashion designers should be looking at other industries, especially adjacent industries like design, and hosting a fashion show the traditional way is extremely expensive, especially when you're an independent brand. And maybe there is a way of looking at alternatives, like whether it's a pop-up shop or something on the street, and get creative. And instead of trying to compete with Paris and Milan, which do fashion shows at such large scale, it is about London finding a different way of bringing people together. And I think the community needs to be much stronger in terms of helping these brands and supporting them, not just on the creative side, but also build more viable businesses, finding the right investors, working with retailers the right way, and getting mentorship financially as well.
And that's all we've got time for this week's edition of The Curator. The show is produced by David Stevens and presented by me, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Join us again next week, and thank you for listening.